Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So I hope you're all doing great. Now, yeah, let's start. So before we start today's lecture, I have a few quick announcements. First, please make sure you check the announcement carefully. Homework one is due today, and homework two is due on June 3rd. Also, there will be an exam on May 29th, I think this Friday, and the exam covers the materials we have covered so far, including GDP, inflations, and we're gonna include unemployment and also business cycles. There will be also makeup videos for the last two chapters, so please make sure you complete those before the exam. And I just want to say, I know this is an online class, and I know you have some flexibility, but please try to stay on schedule so that you're not rushing right before the exam. All right. Today we'll continue from where we stopped last time. Last class we talked about the basic definitions of GDP and the three ways of measuring GDP as well. Today we'll continue with examples, expenditure components, real versus nominal GDP and GDP deflator, and finally move into inflation and CPI. All right, let's go. So yeah, let me briefly remind you of the main ideas from last class. GDP was the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period, right? We also talked about the differences between real and nominal GDP, and briefly we introduced that GDP can be measured using expenditure, income, and total output, like something like that. And today we will build on those ideas and practice how to calculate and interpret them. All right, let's begin with the quick question before starting. So suppose Siri pays Alexa $50 to mow her lawn. Um, then what will gonna happen to total expenditure and total income? Any ideas? We have few students here. I wish you could answer. Yeah. And
Uh,
mhm.
oh, sorry.
No,
Would
you're
our
good.
total expenditure be $50?
Yeah, pretty nice. It is pretty intuitive, right? So yeah, perfect. So suppose Siri pays Alexa $50, then from Siri's side, she spends $15 to buy a service, right? So total expenditure increases by $50. And also same idea. Like from Alexa's side, she receives $50 as income for providing the service. So total income also increases by $50. So the main point here is that one person's spending becomes another person's income. And this is why we talked about this last time for the economy as a whole, like total expenditure and total income are connected. Now, yeah, I added a little nice figures over there. This slide summarizes the three ways of measuring GDP. So first one is total income, which is no, I'm sorry, total spending, right? This means that we measure GDP by adding up every dollar of spending, and this approach focuses on who is buying goods and services, like mostly consumers, right? And the second one is total income, like that in blue box. This means that we measure GDP by adding up every dollar of income earned. And the last one is total output. This also means that we measure GDP by adding up the values of production. So theoretically, Like all of these three measures like should give us like the same sorry, I have put me some. So all of these three measures should give us the same exact number. But like in real world, like datas are kind of like collected from different sources, so they might not perfectly match. But still, like think of this like conceptually, they are measuring the same economic activity. So yeah, now we're gonna like look into like three ways of it, like one by one. First one, we're gonna focus on the like expenditure approach. The expenditure approach measures GDP by adding up spending on final goods and services. And here is the formula, which is like Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. And here Y stands for GDP, C is consumption, I is investment, and G is government purchases, and NX is net export. The important thing over here is that each part represents a different type of like spending in the economy. So we're going to go through like each one by carefully. So first one is like consumption. So consumption is like spending, right? Spending by households on goods and services. And here we call goods are tangible items, like for example, like food, clothes, like or cars, like something like that. And services are intangible things like yeah, what would be like something like haircuts and medical services or tutoring like me, right? A lot of like everyday spendings by households is like, considered as like consumption. The second one was investment, right? In economics, investment does not mean buying stocks and bonds. I know it's confusing, but that is a common misunderstanding. So in GDP, when we calculate GDP, investment means like spending on goods that will be used in the future to produce more goods and services. Like for example, like if a business buys machinery, like let's think about it. That is supposed to be like investment. If a company builds a new factory, that is also investment. What else? Residential construction, like a new apartment building or a new house. Also, that also counts as like investment. One last thing, we're gonna be inventory accumulation. That also counts as, you know, investment because the goods were produced even if they have not been sold yet, right? So remember, in GDP, investment means like fiscal capital, what was that? Structure, intellectual properties, and also housing, and also inventories. It does not mean like financial investment, like, buying stocks or bonds. Like that is like really confusing part. So like please try to like remember it. And also, there is like government spending part. Government spending includes like spending on goods and services purchased by government, of course. For example, if the local government builds a public school, let's say it, that also considered as like government spending. Or what else? If the government pays the salary of a public school teacher, that also counts as like government spending. Like one thing you have to remember over here is like transport payments are not included as like government spending, which means that for example, let's think of like food stamps or unemployment insurance, like something like that. Those are not considered as like government spending. That is because the government is not buying a new goods or services. So it is like kind of like transferring like money from one to another, not just like buying it. So if we like focus on the definition of like GDP, like we'll know like what to include it or what to be excluded. And lastly, we have net exports. Of course, we know all the definition. I'm just like, trying to remind you. Exports are goods and services produced domestically and sold other countries, right? And imports are goods and services produced abroad and bought domestically, right? And net exports are kind of like simple, of course. They are just like exports minus imports. So like, if we export more than like import, net exports are positive, and if we import more than we export, net exports are gonna be negative. This was like first the approach like we had to learn. Now we're gonna move to the like second one. So, these are kind of like second one, which is called a income approach. So the income approach measures GDP by adding up income earned in production. So in a simpler version, total income includes wages and also profits. So I brought some, examples over here. Let's look at it. Um, a coffee bean farm earns like revenue, pays wages, and keeps the rest of the profit, right? And suppose like they sell like coffee beans to Copa Joe, because I go there a lot. Um, if we add like total like wages and total profits, we get like total income. In this example, total wages were $7, right? Because like we added up like 2 plus 5 here and 7. And also like we're gonna add up like profits as well. So profits from Coffee Bean Farm was like $8 and Copa Joe was like $25, which it add up to like $33. And once after we add up like this total wages and total profits, we're gonna get a like total income of like $40. So, yeah, the key idea is that the value of like final output becomes an income for someone. And it may go to workers or like as a wages or to business owners as a profit. That is like key point of like income approach. And the last one is, yeah, total output approach. So this approach focuses on a value added at each stage of like production. Like here, value added means that the amount by which a film increases the value of the product. So the formula is like very simple, which is value added equals total sales minus the cost of intermediate inputs. I brought also an example, like same one as like the previous. So we knew like they had revenue of like $10 and $40 before, right? Then just compare it like with the previous stage. Then we know that Coffee Bean Farm added their value by $10 and Kawajo added like $30. So here we just add up like all the value added, then we're gonna get a like total output of like $40. So the reason we use like this approach is to avoid double counting. So we do not want to count the coffee beans once and then like they are sold to a coffee shop and then again like inside final cups of coffee. So yeah, this is another way of like measuring GDP. But sorry. But also there of course ha there of course exists like limitations of the GDP. GDP is like very useful, but of course it is not perfect. There are some reasons why. First of all, prices are not the same as values, which means that something may have like higher market price, but that does not always like it improves like like well-being of like society. And the second one is like non-market activities are excluded. This means that if you ever cook dinner at home, that work has a value, right? You still put your labor in it, right? but it is not counted in GDP because there is no market transaction. And third one is the shadow economy is like missing. Like for example, like some activity, like some economic activities, like let's say that that happens like informally or illegally. And then if that is the case, like they will not gonna be reported, and then that kind of like economic activities are gonna be missing. And the fourth one is like environmental degradation is not directly counted. Like, yeah, for example, like if some production increases and s- they they also increases like causes like some kind of like pollution, like air pollution, like for example, then like at the end like GDP may rise, but even though like like environmental qualities are falling. And the fifth is like leisure does not count, very direct. If people work more hours, GDP may rise, but they may have like less free time. Lastly, GDP ignores like distribution, which means that GDP can be high even if like income is like very unequal. So basically, like they're saying, GDP does not measure happiness or fairness directly, but it does measure like some resources that society has available. Yeah. And yeah, that is probably why economists like still use it as an important indicator. All right. So we're gonna hop into like real and nominal GDP. So please be careful here because like the key distinction is prices. So like nominal GDP values like production using current prices. So nominal GDP can increase either because we produce more goods or services or because prices increase, right? Like intuitively it is. Real GDP values production using, like constant prices from a base year. So real GDP removes the effect of the price changes and more focuses on the changes in the actual production. For example, like if the economy produces the same amount of like goods as last year, but all the price doubles, like let's say it, then nominal GDP will rise, but real GDP will not rise. But because like, like actual production did not decrease. So basically, nominal GDP tells us the value of outputs at the today's price, and real GDP tells us how much output changed after correcting for the inflation part. So I brought some quick calculation. So I have like this table, and we're gonna like calculate real and nominal GDP in 2023 using 2021 as base year. So basically for real GDP we use base year prices, right? And since we have like 2021 as like base year, we're gonna use like 2021 prices. Like I just like boxed it over here, right? And for like, yeah, just like, multiply it by, P, price and quantity, and add up like all the like, you know, all the figures over there, like you're gonna get a like real GDP. And for the nominal one, as we were gonna use like current year price. So we're calculating like 2023 GDP. We just like use like 2023 price as well. So as you can see, there is like difference between like real GDP and like nominal GDP, and real GDP is corrected for the inflation part. Right. And then now we're going to talk about like GDP deflator. So GDP deflator is the ratio of like nominal GDP to real GDP multiplied by 100. This measures the current level level of prices relative to the price level in the base year. So if the GDP deflator is 100, that means the prices are the same as in the base year. If deflator is like over 100, like suppose like 150 or something, that means like the overall price level is like 50% higher than in the like base year. Then to calculate inflation using the GDP deflator, we look at the percentage increase in the GDP deflator from 1 year to another, 1 year to the next. So the inflation rate equals to current year GDP deflator minus previous year GDP deflator. Oh my God, wordings are so hard. Divided by, the previous year's GDP deflator times 100. So the big idea here is like kind of like simple. The GDP deflator is also a price index. So inflation is the percentage change of it. And this is like almost all we have for the GDP part. And now we can finally hop into like inflation officially. So this is like something to remind, just like check it before you study by yourself. Yeah, inflation is a generalized rise in the overall level of like prices. This is like one of the like most important topics in like macroeconomics because it affects like everyday life. Like, like you always like hear about like inflation rate is high or, low or something like that, like in the news, like they always like, focuses on that. It affects like how much people can buy and how households like plan their budgets as well. And like also like not just like households, like how films like set prices or like more, if we go like more larger, like how policymakers like make their decisions as well. So like we're gonna talk about like what inflation means and how to measure it and what is like CPI and like how CPI differs like from the GDP deflator. So, yeah, I just like read it already, but inflation is a generalized rise in the overall level of prices. This means that inflation is not just like one price going up. So, for example, like if like only the price of like strawberries increases, that is not necessarily like inflation. We don't say it as like inflation. Like inflation in general, like it means the overall cost of like many goods and services is rising together. So inflation is also related to like purchasing power, which means that when prices rise, each dollar buys fewer goods and services than before. So like inflation can be understood as a decrease in purchasing power of money, like we have like less power of like money. So there is like more than like one measure of like inflation. One we learned right before, like uses like the GDP deflator. Another one very commonly used is the consumer price index, which is CPI. CPI is like if especially like relevant to consumers because it kind of like focuses on the goods and services that households typically buy. So yeah, let's see it like a little deeper. So like CPI like is measures like they're measuring the overall cost of like goods and services specifically bought by like consumers. So we can think of like CPI as an approximation of like cost of like living. And for example, like if CPI increases, like that means like the overall increase, there is an overall increase in the cost of living, which results in inflation. And if CPI decreases, like that means like, like the cost of living is falling, and we call that like deflation. So like the important praise here is like market basket, And CPI is based on like baskets of like consumer goods and services. And typically like economies like track how the cost of that basket changes over time. All right. So yeah, this is it. This slide like gives like examples of like categories included in CPI, like such as like transportation, housing, apparel, recreation, education and like communication, medical care, and food and beverage. Like I just like added like for example, so CPI is not based on like just like one good. So it is based on like weighted baskets. Here, weighted basket means that goods and services that take up a larger share of like consumer spending receive like more weight. Like, yeah, let's say it. For example, housing is usually taking a large part of like household spending, right? Like, that's how I feel. So it has a large weight in CPI. And like this kind of like different weights will gonna be adjusted. So like the market basket price is calculated by like taking each goods price and multiplying it by like its quantity and adding everything together. So like let's go like a little more practical. So here is the formula. Like first like we're gonna learn like how to calculate CPI. There are like three steps to calculate it. So first, like we calculate the basket's cost. We multiply the price of like each good by a quantity of like that good, and then add them all together. Then CPI equals the basket's cost in the current year divided by the like basket's cost in the base year. Oh, of course, you gotta like multiply by, about 100. Okay, like one more thing we need to like remember is after we calculate CPI, we now can calculate inflation. Inflation equals like current CPI minus last year's CPI divided by last year's CPI. So like don't confuse like, it is divided by last year and also like multiply by 100. So the steps are like kind of like first calculate the cost of like baskets, and then second calculate the CPI, and then finally we can calculate the inflation rate. So yeah, we will gonna try to like, do quick calculation. It is, oh, not this one. I'm sorry. Yeah. So we're gonna like try to like calculate CPI for 2022 and 2023 and using 2022 as like base year and then try to like calculate the inflation rate from 2022 to like 2023. So we have like two goods, like I just like picked random one, like beef and chicken and we're asked to calculate it, right? So when calculating like CPI, we use like base year baskets. Since we have like 2022 as the base year, we were gonna use like 2022 quantities. So for beef, it will gonna be like this. We use like quantity of like 10 over there. And for chicken, we use the quantity of like 20. Then we calculate how much like this same baskets cost in like 2020 and 2023. So let's calculate the cost of like baskets in 2020 first, which is over there. 4 times 10 plus 4 times 20, which is add up to 120, right? And since 2022 is the base year, this two $120 will gonna be the denominator when we calculate the CPI. Now, we have to calculate 2023 baskets cost, which is pretty simple. Um, $8 times 10 plus $5 times 20, which is add up to 180. And for 2022, the baskets costed was like on $120. And yeah, for 2023, it increased to like 180. And now we will gonna calculate CPI. So for 2022, like base year is equal to current year. So like we're gonna just like use the same one, which means that we divide to 120 by 120 times 100, which is equal to 100. And this is always true for base year. And for 2023, we're gonna use current year versus base year. So we're gonna divide 180 by 120, which becomes like 150. This kind of like means that the cost of like basket in 2023 is like 50% higher than in the base year. So you need to like remember how to interpret them as well, and like how to calculate it as well. So once after we calculated CPI, now we can calculate the inflation rate, right? So inflation rate was like percent change of like CPI, which means that we can just like, do like bottom there. I just like wrote a like use the like that formula. So we first do like nominator part and then divide by denominator and then like just like multiply by like 100, we're gonna give you inflation rate. So like according to this CPI calculation, inflation rate from 2022 to like 2023 is 50%. And this inflation rate is not CPI itself. Just remember, CPI is the price index and inflation rate is the percent change of like CPI. All right. So yeah, this slide summarize like, like two ways to calculate inflation. We first, calculated the inflation using CPI right before, right? So we take current CPI minus past CPI, divide by past CPI, and multiply by 100. And second one was like we used like GDP deflator to calculate inflation rate. The formula structure is exactly same in both cases. Like they are percent change in price index. Just like the difference is like which price index we use. So CPI uses the cost of like a consumer basket, but the GDP deflator uses like nominal and real GDP to measure prices. Then what is like, like difference between two of them, right? So we're gonna compare like CPI and like GDP deflator. Like the first difference is like imported like consumer goods. Like if you remember the definition, like imported like consumer goods are included in CPI because consumers are buying them, right? But they are excluded from GDP deflator because GDP only includes goods and services produced like domestically. Like, for example, if American consumers are buying like imported goods, like those goods can affect CPI, but they are not included in US GDP because they were produced abroad. Like the second difference is capital goods. Capital goods are excluded from CPI because CPI only focuses on like, consumer goods and services, but they are included in GDP deflator. And the last one is the baskets. So like CPI uses fixed baskets of goods and services bought by consumer, right? Um, However, the GDP deflator uses all goods and services. So they have like, like different things included. So like CPI is more focused on like consumers, while GDP deflator is like a little bit broader in terms of like domestic productions. Yeah. And yeah, of course, we have some issues with CPI. And now let's discuss like some issues with CPI. Like the first issue is like substitution bias, which means that CPI uses a fixed basket. Right. Like consumers do not always like buy the same basket when price changes. Like, for example, if beef becomes like much more expensive or way more expensive, then probably like consumers may buy more chickens or like something else, right? Then but still, like CPI still assume like consumers are buying the original amount of like beef. So it can kind of like overstate the increase in the cost of like living. That is one of their issue. And the second issue over here is the introduction of new goods means that, like when new goods enter the market over time, you know, CPI is based on like the fixed basket, which means that it may not immediately capture how new goods improve, like, like consumer choices or like, change the like cost of like living. And the last issue is like a measured quality changes. So sometimes like there are some like cases, the price of like goods rises because its quality improves for the same, product. Like for example, like I bought a phone, right? I bought a phone today. Like let's suppose I bought a phone today, and maybe more it becomes more expensive than like a phone years ago. That is because, like they have like much better, like functions or something like that. So if CPI does not fully adjust like for quality improvements, like it may overstate like inflation as well. So like here we gotta think like CPI is very useful, but it is not as perfect. Yeah. That is like three major issues with CPI. And lastly, like we're gonna connect inflation to the interest rates. So, like, inflation affects the benefits and cost of like savings and borrowing money, which is the reason like we're gonna connect like real interest rate and like nominal interest rate to the like inflation rate. So yeah, the nominal interest rate is the interest rate not corrected for the inflation. Yeah, whenever like we say nominal, it is not corrected. It tells us like, how fast the dollar value of like deposit or debt growth. So on the other hand, real interest rate is corrected for the inflation, of course, by definition. It tells us like, how fast like purchasing power grows. There is like simple formula, real interest rate equals to nominal interest rate minus inflation rate. So for example, suppose like your bank account, let's say, pays a 5% nominal interest rate, then and we say like inflation rate is like 3%, then your real interest rate is about like just like 2%. Your money increased by like 5% in dollar terms, but the price also rise by, like 3%. So your purchasing power increased by only about like 2%. So this kind of like matters because what we really care about is not just like, how many dollars we have, right? But we are more interested in, how much those dollars can actually buy things. Yeah. This is like the last part of like inflation part. So we can just like briefly summarize like today's lecture. So we first reviewed like that GDP can measure it by expenditure, income, or output, right? Then we focused on the expenditure approach. Like there was a formula using Y equals C plus I plus like G plus NX. And we also discussed real versus like nominal GDP, and also most importantly, how to calculate it and how the GDP deflator helps us to like measure, inflation rate, right? Then we move to CPI, which measures the cost of the fixed consumer basket. We also practice like calculating CPI. You have to know how to do that, and also including inflation rate. And we compared like CPI with a GDP deflator, and also discuss like some limitation of like CPI. So, like for the exam, please make sure you can actually calculate real GDP, nominal GDP, the GDP deflator, CPI, like all the formulas. Like try to like get used to like how to do that, and also focus on definitions as well. And maybe if you have like more time, like you can focus on like, like some examples as well. And also make sure you understand conceptual differences between like CPI and GDP deflator. That will gonna help you a lot. Do we have any questions today? Um, no, right. If we don't have any questions, yeah, we can just like, finish our class over here. I'm gonna upload like another like videos like for the last two part. That will not gonna be long as like regular classes. And please try to like watch all the videos like I have uploaded and try to like, go to Macmillan Learning Center. They do have like also like end of chapter practices that will gonna help you a lot. All right, good luck, and I'll see you later again. Bye.